streaming handheld market seems to be showing no signs of slowing down. In just the past few months, I've looked at offerings from both Logitech and Razer on this channel. The G Cloud, which was specifically aimed at the streaming audience, and the Razer Edge, which made it a point to include it as part of their marketing. We now have another streaming-focused handheld from a newcomer, simply named ABXYLUTE, and not too long ago we took an early look at the streaming capabilities of this specific handheld. While this device is strictly meant to be a streaming handheld first, we will definitely take a look at all of its potential capabilities. Does the ABXYLUTE offer a competitive option in this growing segment of the handheld market, or does it ultimately find itself being outdone by its more established competitors? Please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we take a lengthy in-depth look at the engineering sample of the ABXYLUTE Cloud handheld. As we always do, let's first talk about the specs of the ABXYLUTE, which comes equipped with a 7-inch 16:9 ratio LTPS 60Hz display with a 1001 contrast ratio at a resolution of 1920 by 1080. It is powered by the Mediatek 8365 with quad-core Cortex A53 and a Mali G52 GPU. It is available with 4GB of LPDDR4 RAM and 64GB of internal storage that is expandable with a microSD slot. It supports 802.11ac with 2x2 multi-user multiple input multiple output Wi-Fi technology and a USB-C port for data and charging only. There is no video out capabilities. There is a 5200 mAh battery that the ABXYLUTE team claims will allow you to game for 8 hours, and it will ship with Android 12 out of the box. At the time of publishing this video, it should be available for $199 with an included case as a Kickstarter promotional price, and will go up in price after the Kickstarter promotion has ended. Retail units should be shipping sometime in late April or May. So let's take a look at what was sent with this engineering sample of the ABXYLUTE. You can see that this outer box is most likely not a representation of the final packaging for the handheld. Let's gently undo the flap here and reveal what's inside this box. Alright, it looks like we do have a case that has been placed in what looks to be a produce bag, and this is super crunchy. Alright, we'll toss that aside. They did send the unit with a U-Green case, which is a brand I have some familiarity with and have used before for other devices. I did ask the ABXYLUTE team about what will be included with the final version, and they told me that the packaging will be different and they are in the process of getting a custom case made to fit the device better for the mass production unit. The case will still be included as part of the package, as well as a 5V 3A charging cable and instructions. Okay, so with that quick unboxing out of the way, let's take a tour around the ABXYLUTE handheld. Starting at the top right of the unit, we have a stacked shoulder button configuration with Hall effect analog triggers, and at the top of the unit, the power button and volume up and down buttons. On the left side of the handheld, we have the set of shoulder buttons, and everything is pressing down nicely on both sides. The analog triggers have a good amount of travel and are not stiff to press down on. So while we are on the left side of the unit, let's go down the face of the handheld, starting with the Xbox style select button, and you can see the Hall effect analog sticks there as well. Let's take a look at this from a different angle, and you can see how the analog stick sits above the face of the ABXYLUTE. No issues with rotation or clicking in on them. Here's the D-pad, and apparently this design has been improved on from this engineering sample. However, I will comment on what is in my hands right now. You can see how this has decent height above the face of the unit and has a nice satisfying amount of travel when pressing down on each end. Looking at this D-pad from the front, and I personally like D-pads that have a very defined center pivot point, which this D-pad has a little bit of, but when you press down from the center, it feels quite mushy, which is different than when pressing down strictly at the ends of this D-pad. I will be talking further and demonstrating more with the D-pad in just a little bit. Now moving on to the bottom of the ABXYLUTE, you can see we have the microphone, the USB Type-C port, which only supports charging and data. There is no video out, which again was something I suggested to the ABXYLUTE team, but is something they claim they would consider in future models. The 3.5mm headphone port, and finally the microSD expansion slot. Now moving to the front right side of the handheld, you can see the Xbox style start button and then the ABXY buttons, which are backlit in blue right now, but in the final units will act as an indicator for network strength. The Hall effect right analog stick, and then the home button. Coming back to the face buttons, these are quite satisfying to press down on, and I think these are quite good as they are. The ABXYLUTE team has told us that the current button sensitivity might be harder because of the type of silicone that is being used in these engineering units. However, I have to say I think these press down very well, and you can see they do sit nicely above the face of the unit. Okay, powering on the ABXYLUTE, and the first thing I was greeted with was a very familiar screen, and you can see that the ABXYLUTE is using the same handheld mode front end as we've seen on the G Cloud. Now for the most part, these two launchers are identical, with some refinements and improvements on the Logitech side, given that it was released back in October of last year and has seen a few updates since its release. At this point, it's pretty apparent from seeing this, the G Cloud, and the cancelled Lenovo Legion Play prototype that Tencent is very much involved here. Okay, in the settings area, you can see that the Logitech does have added features, which I did cover in a follow-up video on the G Cloud, but they are notable since that device now has virtual gamepad mapping, as well as the ability to select different settings for the analog stick sensitivity and dead zones. Both of these features are presently missing on the ABXYLUTE, and I have been told by the team that the gamepad mapping is a feature that will be coming at some point, and that apparently they are ahead of the G Cloud in some of these features. Additionally, they stated that since they are using Hall effect analog sticks, they claim that they will have the ability to further adjust stick sensitivity and may give the option to adjust the style of the joystick in the future. Okay, so launching into a game, and you can see that holding down on the home button will bring up the quick access menu similar to the G Cloud. Another thing when you are in handheld mode is that none of the touchscreen based gestures are available like what you would have when you are in tablet mode. Again, this is similar to the G Cloud as well. Now, one last thing I wanted to demonstrate was something that I noticed over on the G Cloud's launcher. So when you go to close an app from within the handheld mode launcher, it would appear that the app is no longer running. However, when you return to tablet mode and then swipe up to see the multitasking window, you can see that in fact these apps are still running in the background, and this is the same thing here on the ABXYLUTE Handheld. Now, despite this being an engineering sample, I have to say I was pretty impressed by the overall build quality. This is actually put together better than some other manufacturers, and for their first attempt at a product, shows some nice refinements. Now, there are concerns I have with my specific unit, which comes down to some small finishing details that I picked up on. For example, the shoulder buttons are a bit rough at the top when sliding your finger across it, and I'm hoping to see that the plastic gets smoothed out a bit. Likewise, I noticed the same finishing issue in the bottom corners of the handheld where the palm of my hands rest, and it is a little jarring, and again, something I'm hoping to see smoothed out in the final version. I did let the team at ABXYLUTE know, and I'm hoping that they will address these issues in the final version. Another thing I caught on to was that the micro SD slot is recessed too deep to easily insert or remove the micro SD card. I actually had to use a tweezer to get the card in and out of the device. Now, the ABXYLUTE team states they are aware of this issue, and they did say in the product documentation that they are working to address this issue. I will definitely say that these finishing issues need to be addressed for the final unit, and unfortunately, just like anyone viewing this, all I can do is wait and see if these concerns will be addressed. Now, outside of what I mentioned, the device itself is very solid. I like the indent on the back, it makes the device nice to hold. I'm not noticing any flexing or creaking of the plastic, nothing is loose or rattling. So let's check out the display in more detail. Now, as I mentioned in the specs, this has a 7-inch 1920 by 1080 resolution LTPS panel, and for anyone unfamiliar, that stands for low temperature polysilicon, which allows for better resolution, response time, and lower power consumption over standard LCD displays. The picture is very nice on here. There is no backlight bleeding, viewing angles are good, and compared with the G Cloud, they are pretty close. However, I do think the G Cloud gets slightly brighter and its backlight adjusts a little bit better than what is seen here with the ABXYLUTE unit. Okay, let's finally talk about the D-pad, which is easily one of the areas that I've been asked about most. Now, I will flat out say that I prefer the D-pad on this device over the G Cloud. However, just because it feels better to me isn't really much for you, the viewer, to go on. It's probably more important to see how this performs, and while I am not great at fighting games, I will be using Marvel vs. Capcom 2 on Dreamcast as my test game. You probably noticed that I have a few friends joining the party for this demonstration, and I really think this one will be one of the best ways that I convey to you how effective or ineffective the D-pad is on the Absolute. Now, please excuse my skills, I am definitely not great at fighting games, but let's naturally start with the Absolute. You can see that I am definitely struggling to hit the combos for a simple Hadouken, and I'm really struggling to get those corners registered on the inputs. And so while I mentioned this D-pad presses down nicely on the ends, it's definitely a problem when looking at something like a fighting game. I really have to focus very hard on trying to nail this combo, which is a fairly simple one. Now over on the G Cloud, you can see that I am struggling just the same, and it's pretty well known that the D-pad on the G Cloud isn't the greatest, especially if you are a fighting game fan, and oddly enough, going the other way seems to register better on the G Cloud. I also want to make a note that I did return my G Cloud to its stock D-pad configuration so that we can keep things nice and fair here. So continuing on with the demonstration here, I have the Razer Edge with the Razer Kishi version 2 Pro, and you can see that I am definitely starting to hit those combos with a lot more regularity. And finally, the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, which has, in my opinion, the best D-pad out of the bunch, and you can see how effortlessly I am able to nail the combo, regardless of which direction I am facing. Again, I am not a fighting game pro, but the fact I can consistently nail this combo really demonstrates that there is more to overcome with the D-pad on the Absolute, which while I feel is better than the G Cloud, still isn't quite what someone who enjoys fighting games will want to see. Out of all these handhelds that I selected, as I mentioned, the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus is easily the best, with the Kishi version 2 doing a decent job as well. The poorest performers are definitely the G Cloud and Absolute, with just a slight edge going to the Absolute. Now, Absolute has claimed they have already made adjustments to this D-pad, and they do have a YouTube video demonstrating this, but again, I am basing this on the engineering sample that I have in my hands, and I cannot pass proper judgment without a final unit to compare to. While we are on the topic of inputs, I might as well touch upon the analog sticks. Personally, I was disappointed to see that the Absolute is using Switch-style sticks on a device of this size. I think something larger like what is seen on the G Cloud would have made more sense here. Now, despite that the Switch sticks aren't the worst thing in the world to me, as I am quite accustomed to them since they are so common nowadays. However, let's test the sensitivity and dead zones briefly here. You can see how sensitive the sticks are with just a simple flick, and right now the sticks are set up to have that circular range, which for its target of cloud gaming isn't necessarily an issue. However, I would really like to see Absolute give the option to have the user select their own sensitivity and dead zone preferences. You can see over on the G Cloud that this is now a feature that has been included, and again, everyone has different preferences when it comes to this. You can see the differences here between the default option on the G Cloud versus changing it over to something like high performance, which gives you a different dead zone and sensitivity, as can be seen here. I did suggest something like this to the Absolute team, and they seem to be focused on this being a cloud gaming device meant to play AAA games through those streaming services, which is understandable as that is how this is being marketed. However, they did state that they will add this feature in a post-production version, and because they are using Hall sticks, they claim they will have more options to adjust. Again, all I can do is sit and wait and see if these changes will be made to the device in the future. Alright, enough talk about inputs and that upsetting demonstration of my skills. Let's do some size comparisons. First up, of course, is the Logitech G Cloud, which is very similar in size to the Absolute. The Razer Edge with that Kishi version 2 Pro attachment, the very tiny in comparison Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, and finally a well-known quantity with the original Nintendo Switch. Moving on to the weigh-in, and the Absolute is up first, coming in at 15 ounces or 425 grams. The Retroid Pocket 3 Plus at 236 grams or a little over 8 ounces. The Nintendo Switch at 14 ounces or about 400 grams. The G Cloud at 463 grams or a little over 16 ounces, which makes it a little heavier than the Absolute. And finally, the Razer Edge at 13.5 ounces or 382 grams. Here's a side-by-side of the G Cloud and ABXYLUTE comparing the thickness of the units. The top thickness of the ABXYLUTE measures at around 14mm and the bottom portion is about 12mm. In comparison, the G Cloud comes in at about 13.5mm, and for fun, here's the Switch coming in at also about 13.5mm. Okay, let's get to one of my favorite parts of these in-depth videos, and it appears that lots of viewers feel the same way. This is where we will do a little bit of a teardown and take a peek at what's inside the ABXYLUTE Handheld. First thing, I will say that this is much easier to get that back plate off compared to what I had to deal with over on the G Cloud. You can see that it pretty much just snaps right off without much effort to reveal another back plate hiding underneath. Alright, let's take a closer look at the unit without the beauty cover on in a little more detail. I have to comment and say that there seems to be a bunch of screws here holding this plate, and I think it'll be a lot of fun removing all of these. Okay, let's begin this process. These all appear to be standard screws, and I will speed up through this so that we don't have to watch me remove all of these. By the way, if you wanted to know, there were 22 screws holding this back plate in place. Okay, so with all of that removed, this back plate is also quite easy to remove and seems to separate very easily. I'll go a little slow here as I'm not quite sure what is underneath and I don't want to break anything by accident. Alright, with that off, let's look on the other side and you can see the haptic motors here. Again, more plastic, nothing too surprising here. Now we can take a closer look at the inside of the ABXYLUTE. I will definitely say that this was a much easier experience to get down to the motherboard compared to the G Cloud, which was quite an experience. Everything seems to be nicely assembled here, and really I'm not noticing anything that looks poorly done. The analog sticks look pretty simple to access and as a result should be simple to replace if needed. Here's a nice centered shot of the unit, so take your screen caps if you'd like. You can see the Wi-Fi modules up top here. Okay, let's get a little closer here, and I do want to dive in a little deeper and take a look at the D-pad and check out that membrane. There's a couple of ribbon cables here that I will carefully remove so that we can get clean access to the left daughter board. Alright, let's remove the screws in place here, and then hopefully get this removed. Okay, nice and easy, and now we can take a look at the D-pad and the membrane being used here, just for curiosity's sake. I do like the way the membrane feels, it's got this nice thunkiness to it. Here's a closer look at the daughter board removed from the shell. Alright, time for everything to go back in. So we've toured the device quite a bit, looked at its innards. Now let's do some synthetic testing and benchmarking to determine the performance of this Mediatek 8365. First, let's get a spec readout from CPU-Z. As you can see, we have that MT8365 with 4 Cortex A53 cores at 2 GHz and that Mali G52 GPU, and here are a few more details from CPU-Z. Alright, so up first with the Geekbench 6 benchmark of CPU performance. You can see that the MT8365 really falls behind some of its competitors in this space. Again, it's understandable that a device that is streaming focused will not necessarily include a higher end SoC, and we will examine some of its decoding capabilities later on in this video. Regardless, the G Cloud, which is also a streaming focused device, delivers nearly 3 to 4 times the performance of that MT8365. Here we have the Antutu benchmark suite, and again the ABXYLUTE is falling behind in every category with the G Cloud offering a sizable performance gain. And finally the 3D Mark Wildlife benchmark, and the ABXYLUTE comes in with a score of 356, and the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, which delivered a gain of 103% over the ABXYLUTE, and the G Cloud delivering nearly a 200% increase over the ABXYLUTE score. Here's some battery testing, and up first with a streaming test using PSPlay streaming locally from my PlayStation 5, making Kratos spin for hours on end at 50% brightness, 50% volume, and the ABXYLUTE was able to hit over 8 hours, which matches the claims made by ABXYLUTE. Next, we have 2 different emulation scenarios testing battery performance. On the left side, I have my go-to Yoshi's Island for a lighter emulation test, and at 50% volume, 50% brightness, with no Wi-Fi or Bluetooth enabled, and the device came in at almost 12.5 hours. Very solid performance here. On the right side, we have some PlayStation Portable emulation with PPSSPP and Daxter running at 4 times native resolution, again with brightness set to 50% and volume set to 50%, and no Wi-Fi or Bluetooth enabled, and we were able to hit a little over 9 hours. Finally, I will comment that the charging is quite slow, and it took me about 2.5 hours to go from 0 to 100%, which I confirm with the ABXYLUTE team is the normal and expected time to charge the unit. Finally, my last test capturing surface temperatures of the device after running Genshin Impact for a good amount of time, and you can see that the device stays well within a reasonable surface temperature, and I never observed the unit reaching over 39 degrees Celsius, which I consider to be good, and the device never feels too hot to handle. Finally, let's move on to some gaming on this thing, and first let's talk about native Android games. For followers of the channel, many know that I am quite a big supporter of native Android gaming, and I have covered it quite a bit on my channel. Now with the ABXYLUTE, I was not expecting a lot here given that we are working with a very weak SoC. Regardless, I did want to check out some lighter Android games. Now I understand that this device is obviously streaming focused, but I do think it's nice to consider your options when it comes to native gaming, which is something that many will ignore. First up is what I consider one of the finest Android ports with Dead Cells, and I was pretty surprised that it's running okay here on the ABXYLUTE. It's certainly better than I expected. Next, and one that hasn't been seen in a little while on the channel, is Horizon Chase, which is definitely a favorite of mine on any platform. Horizon Chase is another that is performing a lot better than I expected. Here's another great Android port. Streets of Rage 4 is nice because it does have built-in benchmarking, and we can see that the game is maintaining above 30 frames per second, hovering around 40 frames per second, and I find this to be pretty playable on here. And finally, this was a viewer request, and I think a good one to just cap off the limitations of Android gaming. Genshin Impact is usually used for a lot of benchmarking to judge performance, but it's also a game that scales quite well across a range of devices. Also, please keep in mind that the ABXYLUTE does not have any gamepad mapping, so I will be using the touchscreen to move around, but I have to be very honest, I can't believe that I managed to get this game even to load and sort of play on this device. But there you have it, some Genshin Impact on the ABXYLUTE. This is obviously not going to be the way you would play this on here, and would probably look at something like Geforce Now or streaming the PC version locally. Okay, so another hot topic for this device, of course, was if this handheld could do anything when it came to emulation, since that MT8365 is really not going to be a heavy performer. So for a lot of my viewers, emulation is definitely an important topic, and I spent a good amount of time going across generations here with multiple consoles and emulators to get a good sense of where we stand. I did not use any screen recording for emulation, as it definitely impacted performance given that we have such little overhead here. Let's start with what would be by today's standards considered one of the easier and commonly emulated consoles, the PlayStation 1. Now for PS1, I use the DuckStation emulator as it is my preferred emulator for this console. To keep things simple, I tested every game here at 3x native resolution with the OpenGL backend. First up, a game that has been a favorite import of mine for a long time now. Pepsi Man is one of those gems that need to be experienced by all, and it's running great here on the ABXYLUTE. Next, another personal favorite of mine, Klonoa is a great 2.5D style platformer that is well worth checking out, and again, no issues running here. Finally, a favorite shmup of mine, and no stranger to the channel, here is Einhander running with no issues. So let's move on to another 5th generation console, and one that I did not expect much out of, as Sega Saturn emulation really does require a fairly powerful SoC to get some consistent and solid performance out of. Here I am using Yaba Senshiro, and as I expected, results were pretty mixed on the Saturn front. I tested a range of my personal favorites on Saturn, and things like Panzer Dragoon were just too slow to be worthwhile on here. Now being a little more realistic, I tested something like Guardian Heroes, and that was definitely decently playable. However, something like Sega Rally Championship or Nights into Dreams just doesn't quite hit that 60 frames per second that we're looking for here. Finally, one more for the 5th generation, and Nintendo 64 fared far better than standard emulation, and using Mupen 64 Plus, Mario 64 has no issues running here. Here is some cruising in world, and again, not bad at all with this one. I did want to test something a little bit harder to run, like Conker's Bad Fur Day, and it was definitely maxing out the capabilities of the Absolute. Okay, so moving on to Sega Dreamcast emulation with Flycast, and Dreamcast emulation has matured so much, it's very much like PSP emulation, and so low-end devices like this actually fare better than you would expect. First up, I tested my usual Cosmic Smash in my never-ending quest to spread awareness of this cool Japanese exclusive. Cosmic Smash is performing nicely here with Flycast. Next, I wanted to test a game that is no doubt one of Dreamcast's most popular with Soul Calibur, and yep, this is running very nicely here. Again, Dreamcast emulation is one of those platforms that does really well across a range of devices. Next we have Nintendo DS emulation with Drastic, and not surprising, but New Super Mario Bros. Is playing great here. So let's move on to another handheld, the PlayStation Portable, which actually really surprised me with how it performed on this device. Going into this, I really didn't expect much beyond maybe some PlayStation 1 and Dreamcast emulation, but naturally, as I very often like to do on the channel, which is testing the limits of these devices. First off, I will say performance is variable based on the game. Obviously, something like Loco Roco, which I have playing in the background, is going to perform without much issue. Now moving on to some 3D games, here is Daxter, which is running at 4x native resolution, and that really surprised me. I think this is just a testament to how good PPSSPP is and how far it has come. To be able to get performance like this on the Absolute is, well, absolutely insane. And here is Ridge Racer, which is also performing very well. Now, of course, something like God of War will need performance hacks to get it running even remotely to the point that it is running like you see here. Personally, I do not find this to be acceptable and would recommend avoiding something like this unless you are more tolerant than I am of some of the heavier hacks and frame skipping. Regardless, I was pleasantly surprised, and I think some will be as well given what we are working with here. Now, let's address GameCube, PlayStation 2, and 3DS. And well, up front, I'm just gonna say, forget about it. GameCube is really not great, and definitely worse than something like the original Retroid Pocket 3 with its Unisoc T310 in terms of performance for sure. I did spend a good amount of time testing all sorts of configurations, versions of Dolphin, and really did try to see where things settle with here. Games like Wind Waker, which were sort of playable on the Retroid Pocket 3, are not really gonna happen here. I did manage to get Pikmin running okay-ish, but again, that's one of the easiest to run GameCube games, so don't expect much in the way of GameCube emulation here. And then there is PlayStation 2, And really, don't expect anything here. This is where our journey with emulation will come to an end. Now, I tested quite a few games that are lighter fare, and most were just not getting to full speed. I have quite a bit of familiarity with PlayStation 2 emulation on lower end hardware, and yeah, I've tested some of the lightest games, and I just really would say that you're not going to get a lot running on here for Aether SX2. I did manage to find very few titles that work, such as Raiden 3 and Guilty Gear X2, but again, don't expect much out of this for PS2 emulation, even using that fast, unsafe preset. Again, this is worse than what I tested with the original Retroid Pocket 3 with its Unisoc T310. Finally, I won't really bother showing it here, but 3DS is pretty much a no-go. Oh, and for fun, I did test Skyline Edge and Sonic Mania runs, which is kinda neat, and I also did test Celeste, but couldn't quite get it to 60 frames per second in-game. So to reiterate, GameCube, PlayStation 2, 3DS, Switch, and Vita are really not happening here at all without a lot of experimentation, tweaking, and even then it will be extremely limited. So if you haven't already, I definitely recommend checking out my prior video, which did cover local and cloud streaming on this device. I recommend that video to get a good impression of how the games will look when played on the handheld directly. For this video, I decided to show only direct capture footage of the games on the cloud and local streaming. So while I will be revisiting streaming here, I wanted to do it with a different angle and also touch upon other details. So without further ado, let's start with Moonlight using Sunshine. I've been specifically asked this question a few times, and because we have full stats available to us on Moonlight, we can take a look at the hardware decoding times on this device. As I commented on before in my prior video, Moonlight is about one of the best local streaming experiences I've had, and it's a great way to stream, which is also very good at scaling, and is quite forgiving of local networks that aren't as high-end. So what you are seeing here is a side-by-side of direct capture footage from both the Absolute and the G Cloud. First, I am showing that my settings are identical across the board for both devices. Then we will get into Guilty Gear Strive, which is part of the Xbox Game Pass, and it's streaming from my local desktop PC.
Who dares to enter the mayhem? So bad guy.
So let's go full screen on Guilty Gear Strive footage on the Absolute, and you can see that I'm having no issues with this stream. And then quickly back to the G Cloud footage, and likewise no issues here. Now let's go over the stats that we are seeing for both devices. I did observe that decoding time increased when I had screen recording on, so I went back and examined how much of an impact this had on decoding times for both devices. It does seem that the decoding times dropped by about 4 milliseconds or so please keep that in mind. And it also seems to me that both the Absolute and G Cloud are very close in terms of their decoding performance. Now please keep in mind that decoding times will be lower when changing settings such as resolution. As my earlier footage showed, I have these streams at 1080p and 60 frames per second. However, I really think that this is too close to call, but let me know what you think down in the comments. I'll let this play through a bit so you can get a decent sense of what performance is like. Okay, moving on to PlayStation 5 Remote Play using the PSPlay app, which is definitely the way to go with this device, and for just streaming from your PS4 and PS5 in general. For this test, I specifically used the 1080p 60 frames per second with HEVC encoding enabled, which is supported by the PlayStation 4 Pro and PlayStation 5, and really stream quality is excellent using the PSPlay app. Now I've been trying to catch up on some God of War Ragnarok, and so I've been using the Absolute in bed, testing the PS5 Remote Play capabilities, and I really didn't have any issues to speak of. But here is direct capture footage of Spider-Man Remastered running on the Absolute with PSPlay, and the image quality is great. I'm not having any weird artifacting or very obvious signs of compression. I think it's a really nice experience using the PSPlay app on the Absolute handheld.
Okay, Yuri, all done. What's happening? Yuri? Yuri!
So let's revisit some cloud streaming here, and again, I will only be using direct capture footage here. If you want to see more, please check out my prior video which focuses in on streaming. First up, and by far the best cloud streaming service, which is Geforce now, and it's really amazing how much better this is over any of the other options out there. I'm using the free tier, and it's truly remarkable that despite not being a premium member, my experience is much better than some of the others I've used. I figured it would be nice to show some Genshin Impact playing on Geforce now, since that would be an ideal situation for someone interested in a cloud-focused device. Moving on to the Xbox Game Pass Cloud, which is appropriate given that I would rank this as the next best experience and can be very hit or miss. Unfortunately, the official Xbox Game Pass app doesn't work without Google Play services, which is not installed on my engineering sample of the Absolute. So as I mentioned in my prior video, I did use the Kiwi browser trick to attempt to get a better feed from Xbox Game Pass Cloud on the browser, but overall stream quality is just not great here. I do have a 0.5 gigabit connection and it's quite solid, and this, well, is just not great. Personally, I would not want to play my Xbox Game Pass games this way. Oddly enough, I had a better experience when playing Forza Horizon 5 a few weeks ago on this same device. However, from what I understand, this isn't unusual with the cloud service for Xbox. Finally, I did a quick test of Amazon Luna, and easily the worst service by far. Honestly, it's just complete trash, and seems like nothing has really changed since the last time I tested it on the G Cloud a few months back. The delay is so bad that when I went to start Mega Man 11, I ended up quitting it by accident, and even when it came time to leave them feedback, there was a delay. So of course, it's almost impossible not to address the elephant in the room, which just so happens to look a lot like this Logitech G Cloud. The reality is that the Absolute is positioning themselves against this product and marketing themselves as a cloud-focused handheld. So I have done quite a bit of comparisons to the G Cloud, and it's definitely worth comparing the Absolute against the G Cloud, which I've had in my hands for a few months now. So really, the question many have asked, or might ask, is what does the G Cloud do better? And the reality is, I'd say almost everything. While the Absolute is nicely built, this is an engineering sample and not representative of the retail unit. Whereas the G Cloud is built very well by a reputable company that has been producing products for decades now, and you are also able to buy the G Cloud at reputable sales channels like Best Buy and Amazon with their full refund and customer support as well. The G Cloud does offer a significant amount of more power, and while many might necessarily care about this, the Android experience is slightly smoother and better on the G Cloud because of it. Now, the one area the G Cloud does not have an advantage over the Absolute is the availability, and that will be of interest to a lot of my viewers, as I know many are not only based in the United States and Canada. At the time of publishing this video, the G Cloud is still only available in the US and Canada, whereas Absolute has plans to offer their product worldwide, which gives them access to a much larger user base. Finally, the G Cloud is regularly priced at $299 US and has been seen as low as $250 US directly from Logitech. This is where things get a little interesting, since if you are in the US or Canadian market and can catch the Logitech at a sale price, for the small increase in price, the G Cloud is a better purchase for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier. The Absolute team is launching with a Kickstarter price of $199 US, which is certainly giving them a little bit of separation, but definitely puts them in a position where many might just start to look at the next option for a little more money. It doesn't help that the Absolute will be increasing in price after the Kickstarter campaign ends, and so the choice between the two becomes even more obvious. And addressing some of my concerns, I think that right off the bat, Absolute is obviously a new company preparing to launch their first product. Now, it's no doubt that the team over at Absolute has been working on their first handle for a decent amount of time, and to me, there's clearly a lot of passion and a drive for quality that is seen even with this engineering sample. However, we are left with some unknown variables, such as post-sales support, which can be seen as an advantage for a company like Logitech. Which brings me to what I'm hoping the Absolute team will address for their production unit. As I talked about, the current engineering sample does need a few more refinements when it comes to finishing. Additionally, there are a few things that the ABXYLUTE team has promised to address when it comes to production units, as well as post-production features and support. At this point, it's almost a recurring theme. Just like Razer, Logitech, and other manufacturers, it seems we, the consumers, are always waiting on companies to deliver on these promises. In the case of ABXYLUTE, the unit I have on hand is an engineering sample, and so this does give the team over at ABXYLUTE a chance to launch their product with these issues already having been addressed. I will definitely be following their progress to see if they can deliver on some of these items, and I do hope I can take a look at a final unit and demonstrate that these changes have been made. At the end of the day, I will end my in-depth look at the ABXYLUTE much like others, and that is to make the choice that works best for your situation, which may or may not always be the same as someone else's needs. We are certainly not shy on the amount of choices available to us today, and I hope that this video will help you make an informed decision. If you are strictly looking for the cheapest way to stream your content on a nice, large 7-inch screen, the ABXYLUTE might be a good option. There are other choices to consider, such as something cheaper like a Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, but you do lose out on that larger screen and analog triggers. But then for a little more, you can start to consider options like the G Cloud if it is available to you. Personally, I'd like to see the ABXYLUTE team keep this at that $199 price point, since it becomes much harder to recommend once that price goes up. As always, I recommend checking out as much coverage as you can to get a good sense of what to expect here with the ABXYLUTE and any product in general. I hope you enjoyed this in-depth look at the ABXYLUTE, and I do hope to return with a production unit to compare against in the future. As always, this is the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.